The Wildcat fighter jolted violently as enemy cannon shells ripped through its tail. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch could only watch in horror as his wingman's plane was torn apart by relentless Zero fire. The Japanese fighter arced upward with effortless grace, circling for another kill. It was May 1942, a month that spelled disaster for many. American pilots locked in dogfights. They had no chance of winning. Thatch had seen this coming long before the first shots were fired. Since the day an intelligence report landed on his desk the previous September, he knew the truth. America's frontline fighters were already outdated before the war even began. The Japanese A6M Zero could climb higher, turn tighter, and outmaneuver every aircraft in the U.S. Navy's arsenal, but what Thatch hadn't realized was just how hopeless the fight would be. Every tactic, every formation American aviators had practiced for years, collapsed against the Zero's agility. What was once military doctrine had become a death sentence in the skies. The harsh reality was undeniable. In a turning fight, the numbers favored the enemy, and the cost was measured in lives. The air in the cramped intelligence office smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and dread. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch sat at his desk, the latest intelligence report spread out before him. It was September 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, and the words on that thin stack of papers chilled him more than any battlefield ever could. The Japanese had a new fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, reports from China described it as impossibly light, impossibly agile. American and British observers insisted it could outclimb, outearn, and outrun almost anything that flew. Thatch ran the numbers again and again, but every time the math came back the same, if the reports were true. The U.S. Navy's proud fleet of F-4F Wildcats would be hopelessly outmatched. He didn't want to believe it. The Wildcat was a solid plane, rugged, stable, a flying tank compared to most. But it was heavy, slow to climb, and handled like a brick in tight turns. The Zero, by contrast, was all grace and energy. Thatch leaned back in his chair, tapping his pencil against the desk. "If this thing is real," he muttered, "we're in trouble." When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December, Thatch's worst fears took flight, literally. Reports came in of U.S. pilots being cut down by Zeros they couldn't even see until it was too late. The pattern was always the same. An American pilot tried to turn with a Zero. The Zero tightened its arc, slipped onto his tail, and fired. The Wildcat's thick armor might save him for a few seconds, but not for long. By early 1942, Thatch knew something had to change. He wasn't just any pilot, he was the commanding officer of VF-3, one of the Navy's most experienced fighter squadrons. His men trusted him, but he couldn't send them into battles they couldn't win. If he couldn't outbuild or outfly the enemy, maybe he could outthink them. One night, long after most of the base had gone quiet, Thatch sat at his kitchen table staring at a blank notepad. His wife was asleep in the next room. A small lamp cast a circle of yellow light across the wood. In front of him lay a handful of wooden matchsticks, his crude stand-ins for airplanes. He began to move them around, sketching imaginary dogfights in his mind. Each stick was a Wildcat or a Zero. He'd push them across the table, imagining attack angles, lines of fire, and escape routes. Every traditional formation he knew failed miserably. Line abreast? Death trap. Echelon? Suicide. The Zero could always get behind the Wildcat before it could react. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Thatch's eyes burned from exhaustion, but his mind kept running the same simulation. What if two Wildcats worked together, not flying separately but as one? He placed two matches side by side, spaced a few inches apart, and imagined them flying on parallel courses. When an enemy dove on one from behind, that pilot would turn toward his wingmen instead of away. The wingman, seeing the attack, would turn inward at the same time, crossing paths. The attacker would suddenly find himself exposed to the guns of the second Wildcat. Thatch froze. He stared at the matchsticks, slowly tracing their paths again. It worked, at least on the table. A coordinated pair could cover each other's blind spots, forcing the enemy into a deadly trap every time he attacked. He grabbed his notebook and began to draw the pattern. Two lines looping and weaving across the page. It wasn't a formation anymore. It was a rhythm, a dance of mutual protection. He called it the beam defense position. Later, others would know it by a simpler name, the Thatch Weave. For the first time in weeks, Thatch smiled. The next morning, he shared the concept with his pilots. They listened, skeptical but intrigued. "You're telling us," one said, "that if a Zero gets on my tail, I'm supposed to turn toward it?" "That's right," Thatch replied. "Because when you do, your wingman's going to turn too, and when he does, he'll have that Zero right in his sights." The squadron laughed nervously. It sounded insane. Every pilot had been taught never to turn toward a pursuer. But Thatch insisted. "You don't beat the Zero by flying like it," he said. "You beat it by thinking smarter." A few days later, he put the theory to the test. Over San Diego Bay, in a series of mock dogfights, Thatch squared off against one of his best men, Ensign Butch O'Hare, a pilot renowned for his precision and aggression. O'Hare flew the enemy role, diving and twisting with every ounce of skill he had. No matter what he tried, Thatch's two-plane team stayed alive. Every time O'Hare lined up a shot, one of the Wildcats would roll toward him, forcing him to break off or risk being shot himself after landing. O'Hare climbed out of his cockpit, shaking his head in disbelief. "Skipper," he said, "that thing works." Thatch nodded, wiping the sweat from his face. "It works on paper and it works in the air," he said quietly. "Let's hope it works in combat." That night, Thatch sat again at his table, staring at the same matchsticks that had sparked the idea. Outside, the Pacific wind howled. The war was closing in fast, and soon his theory would face the ultimate test, not in practice flights, but in a real sky filled with Zeros. He didn't know when or where the next battle would come. Only that when it did, he'd be ready. For now, the matchsticks lay still on the table, frozen in their neat, crisscross pattern, the geometry of survival against an impossible enemy. Asterisk. The morning sun over San Diego cut through the haze, painting the flight line in a hard golden glow. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch stood beside his Wildcat, helmet in hand, watching the crew finish their checks. The Pacific wind whipped across the tarmac, rattling the hangar doors. Today wasn't combat, not yet, but it might as well have been. If his new formation failed here, it would never see the light of war. His pilots were still skeptical. The beam defense position sounded clever on paper, but so did a lot of doomed ideas. Turning toward an enemy was counterintuitive, almost suicidal. But Thatch had earned their trust over years of flying and leading. If he believed it could work, they'd give it a shot. He gathered the men around the chalkboard one last time before takeoff. "Remember," Thatch said, drawing looping arcs in white dust, "when they dive on one of you, don't break away, turn inward. Meet your wingman halfway. You'll cross paths and he'll have a clean shot. Stay tight. Trust the weave." The pilots nodded, though some exchanged doubtful glances. Butch O'Hare, his best flyer and a man known for his aggressive instincts, smirked. "Guess we'll find out if your kitchen table science holds up, Skipper." Thatch smiled faintly. "That's the idea." Engines roared to life, the deep, throaty growl of radial pistons echoing off the hangars. The smell of oil and exhaust filled the air. One by one, the F-4F Wildcats taxied down the runway, their blue-gray fuselages gleaming under the California sun, once airborne. The ocean opened beneath them, a sheet of polished steel stretching to the horizon. The Wildcats formed up in pairs, maintaining careful spacing. Thatch and his wingmen took the lead, with O'Hare in the enemy role. "Flying solo, all right, Butch," Thatch said over the radio, voice calm and even. "You're the Zero. Try to kill me." "Copy that," O'Hare replied, the mischief in his tone barely contained. "Don't take it personal, Skipper." Moments later, O'Hare dove from altitude, streaking down like a hawk on prey. Thatch saw him coming, a dark speck against the blinding sky, and immediately called it out. "He's on me." "Break left." Both Wildcats rolled inward at once, crossing paths in a precise arc. O'Hare's firing window vanished. If he followed Thatch through the turn, he'd fly straight into the sights of Thatch's wingmen. Forced to break off, O'Hare pulled up sharply, trying again from another angle. Again and again he attacked, from the rear, from above, from the side. And every time the two wildcats moved as one, weaving together in a deadly pattern that left O'Hare with no clean shot. On the radio, he laughed in disbelief. "Damn it, Skipper, I can't get a beat on either of you." "Good," Thatch said, banking hard into another turn. "That's the point." After 20 minutes of mock combat, O'Hare finally called it off. "All right, you win. That thing of yours works better than I thought." Back on the ground, the pilots gathered around, adrenaline still pumping. O'Hare clapped Thatch on the shoulder. "You've got something real here. If the Japs ever jump us, I'd want that weave between me and them." Thatch exhaled, allowing himself a small grin. For the first time since the reports about the Zero crossed his desk, he felt a spark of hope. Over the next few weeks, VF-3 drilled relentlessly. The weave became second nature, two planes moving in harmony like dancers tied by an invisible line. They practiced until the motions felt instinctive, until each pilot could anticipate his partner's next move without a word, but outside the safety of training flights, the war was escalating. The Japanese still dominated the skies over the Pacific. The Zero's reputation had only grown at Wake Island. Over the Philippines and the Coral Sea, pilots described them as ghosts, striking and vanishing before anyone could react. Thatch followed every report with growing urgency. He knew his men would face those same ghosts soon. The U.S. Navy couldn't rely on better machines. They didn't have them. They had to rely on better minds. By May 1942, the Navy's carriers were preparing for what would become one of the most decisive battles of the war. The Japanese were advancing again, this time toward a tiny atoll in the middle of nowhere, Midway Island. Thatch and his squadron would be part of the defense. On the eve of their deployment, Thatch walked the flight deck, the night wind snapping against his jacket. The ocean stretched black and endless around the carrier. He paused by his Wildcat, running his hand along the fuselage. He thought about the matchsticks on his kitchen table, the sketches in his notebook, and the faces of the men now sleeping below deck, men who trusted him to get them home. He knew the numbers. The Japanese had more carriers, more planes, more experience, but they didn't have the weave. In his mind, he replayed the test flights, the twisting arcs, the synchronized turns, the calm voices over the radio. It wasn't just a maneuver anymore. It was a shield forged not from steel, but from trust. When the battle came, there would be no do-overs, no mock engagements. The enemy wouldn't be a friend pulling punches in a practice sky. It would be real Zeros, flown by veterans who'd been fighting since China. And yet, as Thatch looked out over the dark water, he felt ready. The fear that had haunted him for months was gone, replaced by quiet resolve. He couldn't control the tide of war, but he could control how his men met it, somewhere far away. Unseen in the night, Japan's carriers were already steaming toward Midway. The showdown was inevitable. And when it came, Jimmy Thatch intended to prove that even against an impossible enemy, intelligence and courage could still win the day. Dawn broke over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, painting the horizon in bands of red and gold. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, as the carriers of Task Force 16 cut their wakes through the endless blue. Above the decks, mechanics worked feverishly to arm and fuel their aircraft. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and tension. Everyone knew this wasn't another patrol. This was it, the battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch stood on the deck of the USS Yorktown, helmet in hand, eyes on the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the earth, the Japanese fleet was coming, 4 carriers strong, escorted by some of the best pilots in the world. Their weapon of choice, the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the same fighter that had haunted Thatch's imagination for months. He looked over at his pilots, the men of Fighting Squadron 3, VF-3, strapping into their Wildcats. They were young, some barely in their 20s, but they'd drilled the Thatch Weave until it was second nature. Thatch had made sure of that. Now, theory would meet reality. "All right, boys," he said into the radio. "Remember what we practiced?" Stay paired up. Keep your eyes open. And if you get a 0 on your tail, trust the weave. At 0900 hours, the Wildcats took off from the carrier deck, heavy with fuel and ammunition. Their mission: escort the slow-moving TBF Devastator torpedo bombers as they went in low against the enemy carriers. It was a suicide job. Everyone knew it. The Devastators were outdated, slow, and lightly armed. But someone had to protect them. As they climbed to altitude, the blue expanse of the Pacific stretched endlessly in every direction. The radio crackled with static and clipped voices. Then suddenly a shout, "Bandits!" 12 o'clock high. Thatch squinted into the sun and saw them, dark specks that grew larger with terrifying speed, Zeros, at least 24 of them. Diving out of the glare like hawks descending on helpless prey, the Wildcats tightened formation. Thatch's pulse quickened, but his voice stayed calm. "All right, here they come. Pair up, execute the weave." The sky exploded into chaos. Tracers stitched across the air. The first Devastators were hit almost instantly, bursting into flames as they plunged toward the sea. Thatch rolled his Wildcat into a hard left turn, feeling the G-forces crush him into his seat. His wingman, Ensign Robert Dibb, mirrored the maneuver perfectly, cutting across his path just as they'd practiced. A Zero dove after Dibb, its 20mm cannon spitting fire, but as it followed through, Thatch's guns blazed. He raked the Zero from nose to tail, watching its wings shear off in a burst of smoke and flame. "One down!" Dibb shouted over the radio. Thatch didn't answer. Another Zero was on him now, closing fast. He pulled back hard on the stick, the Wildcat groaning under the strain. "Break left," he called. Dibb turned inward again, and the two Wildcats crossed. The pursuing Zero flew straight into Thatch's sights. He fired short, controlled bursts. The Japanese fighter erupted in a fireball, spiraling into the sea below. It worked. The weave worked, even against the best pilots Japan had. But the fight was far from over. More Zeros poured in, hunting the remaining American planes. The Devastators were being slaughtered, one after another falling into the ocean. Thatch and his men fought desperately to cover them, but there were too many enemies, too many guns in the sky. "Dibb, you good?" Thatch called. "I'm hit." Came the reply, "Engine's running rough, but I'm still with you." Thatch glanced to his right, saw smoke trailing from Dibb's Wildcat, and his gut tightened. But there was no time to grieve or hesitate. Another Zero screamed down on them. Thatch turned sharply again, crossing Dibb's flight path in a near-perfect arc. The Japanese pilot, caught mid-attack, flew straight through their intersecting line of fire. Both Americans squeezed their triggers, and the Zero disintegrated under a storm of bullets. The radio was chaos, voices shouting warnings, curses, calls for help. Thatch's heart pounded. His mind raced, but his hands were steady. Every decision had to be instant. Every mistake meant death. Minutes felt like hours. By the time the last of the Devastators went down, Thatch's squadron was bloodied but alive. Against impossible odds, they downed at least 4 enemy fighters. Thatch himself had 3 confirmed kills, not by flying faster or higher, but by outsmarting them. As they turned back toward the Yorktown, smoke curled on the horizon. American dive bombers, the SBD Dauntlesses, had found the Japanese carriers. Flames and black clouds rose skyward. Thatch didn't know it yet, but the tide of the war had just shifted. When his Wildcat touched down on the carrier deck, the crew rushed to meet him. His plane was riddled with bullet holes, but still flyable. Dibb's aircraft landed moments later, limping, its fuselage torn but intact. Thatch climbed out of his cockpit, sweat-soaked and trembling from exhaustion. A mechanic handed him a canteen. He drank deeply, looking out toward the horizon where smoke still marked the place of battle. The Thatch Weave had been tested in the crucible of war, and it had saved lives. Word would spread quickly through the fleet. Pilots would whisper about the formation that could beat the unbeatable Zero. For now, though, Thatch said nothing. He simply stared at the burning sky and exhaled, knowing that his small act of ingenuity, born from sleepless nights and matchsticks, on a kitchen table had just changed the course of air combat forever. But Thatch's influence didn't stop with the end of the war. The Navy was entering a new era, one of jet engines, radar locks, and supersonic speeds. Yet, even as the technology evolved, the logic of the weave remained timeless. The same cooperative principles reappeared in the Korean War, where F-9F Panthers used coordinated turns to fend off faster MiG-15s. Later, in Vietnam, F-4 Phantom crews, now two-seat teams of pilot and radar intercept officer, echoed the same concept every time they worked in tandem to bait and ambush enemy GS. In the 1950s. Thatch rose to the rank of Rear Admiral. His career, like his creation, was built not on luck but on intellect. He oversaw tactical development for naval aviation, refining air combat doctrine for a new generation. Yet to those who knew him best, he never changed, humble, calm, and endlessly curious. He often joked that his greatest invention started not in a lab, but on a kitchen table while his wife made coffee in the next room. When the war ended in 1945, the pilots who'd flown under Thatch's leadership returned home with stories of survival, of battles where quick thinking had triumphed over superior machines. They called him a tactician, a hero, a genius. Thatch never used any of those words himself. He preferred to say he was just trying to keep his men alive. Years later, as jet fighters replaced propellers and missiles replaced machine guns, younger aviators still studied his diagrams. They traced the crisscrossing lines of the weave and learned what they really meant, that no matter how advanced the aircraft, air combat would always come down to coordination, timing, and trust. Thatch retired from the Navy in 1967 as a full admiral, closing a career that spanned from biplanes to supersonic jets. Even in retirement, he remained a quiet legend, the man who turned desperation into doctrine. When he passed away in 1981, the Navy honored him with a flyover, 4 F-14 Tomcats, sweeping across the sky in perfect formation, two pairs crossing paths, weaving one final time in his memory. In the roar of their engines, you could almost see it, the same invisible geometry that once played out over the Pacific. Two pilots turning inward, two men protecting each other against impossible odds. A pattern born from fear, transformed into hope. The Thatch Weave wasn't just a maneuver. It was a message across time, that courage and intellect, bound by trust, can outfly anything. Even decades after the last Zero fell from the sky, the Thatch Weave continued to ripple through naval aviation. By the early 1970s, the world had changed. The roar of piston engines had given way to the whine of jet turbines, supersonic fighters streaked across skies in seconds, and radar-guided missiles replaced the careful aim of machine guns. Yet, despite the technological leap, the lessons Thatch had first proven over the Pacific Ocean remained vital. Teamwork, timing, and mutual trust could surpass raw power. At Naval Air Station Miramar, young fighter pilots strapped into F-4 Phantoms were taught the basics of aerial combat. Instructors displayed diagrams from a war that had ended decades earlier, two small rectangles, crossing paths in a perfect weave. This, an instructor would say, is how John Thatch taught Americans to survive against the best aircraft the world had ever seen. Remember it. It's not about your plane. It's about your partner. The Thatch Weave had become more than a maneuver. It was a philosophy. Military planners studied it not only for combat effectiveness, but for its psychological power. The pattern created confidence. It reassured pilots that no matter how superior the enemy, they were never truly alone. Every turn, every crossing reinforced that they were part of a unit, and a unit could survive when individuals could not. Meanwhile, historical studies and military academies emphasized that tactics could overcome technology. In the Pacific, Wildcats had been slower, less maneuverable, and outgunned by Zeros, yet, by exploiting the principles of geometry, timing, and mutual support, Thatch's pilots leveled the playing field. The Weave forced the Japanese fighters into a dilemma: attack one and expose themselves to the other, or disengage entirely. This insight, as simple as matchsticks on a kitchen table, had changed the trajectory of the war in the Pacific. By the 1980s, when F-14 Tomcats dominated carrier decks and the F-15 Eagles patrolled the skies, instructors still traced the weave on whiteboards. Even in a world of radar-guided missiles and beyond visual range engagements, the core idea remained. In complex, chaotic situations, the right coordination and timing could turn the tide. Pilots trained in pairs, teams, and sections, practicing maneuvers that owed their lineage directly to a tactic born from desperation during World War II. John Thatch died quietly on April 15, 1981, 4 days shy of his 76th birthday. He had lived to see the Navy he helped shape evolve into a modern, jet-powered force, yet he remained most proud of one small victory: the lives saved by his matchsticks. From Midway to Vietnam, and even into the age of stealth fighters, the Weave had proven that tactics and teamwork could overcome superior firepower. Looking at the skies above Coronado in his final years, Thatch often thought of those first matchsticks and the nights he spent hunched over his kitchen table. In his mind, every maneuver, every formation, every pilot who trusted his wingmen was a living testament to the power of preparation, creativity, and the courage to innovate when the odds seemed insurmountable. The Thatch Weave had started as a desperate answer to impossible odds. By the end of the 20th century, it had become an enduring symbol, not just of naval air combat, but of how intelligence, trust, and careful planning could triumph over raw strength. From the dogfights over the Pacific to the skies of modern warfare, Thatch's vision had left an indelible mark. The answer might not be faster planes or heavier firepower. Sometimes the solution is simpler than it seems, already within reach, waiting for the right mind to see it. Think about John Thatch, hunched over his kitchen table in 1941, facing impossible odds and knowing every mistake could cost lives. If you were in his shoes with the fate of your pilots in your hands, would you have searched for a solution with relentless focus? Or would you have accepted that some battles can't be won? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share what you would have done, because the choice between surrendering to circumstance and finding a better way is one we all face, in war and work and in life. Sometimes victory isn't about having the best resources, it's about seeing what's already there, and arranging it with courage, creativity, and discipline.